It was 2004, a cold December night in the rural outskirts of Oregon. My uncle and aunt were returning from a family wedding held at a quaint country inn, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. The wedding had been a lively affair, filled with laughter, music, and dancing that stretched well into the early hours of the morning. By 2:30 a.m., it was time for them to make the long drive back to their home in Bend. The route to the wedding venue had been scenic, but perilous. Narrow, winding roads hugged the cliffsides, punctuated by sharp turns and deep potholes. Adding to the danger was the absence of streetlights, making nighttime travel on that path akin to courting disaster. So instead of retracing their steps, my uncle opted for a safer alternative, the state highway. Though it added an extra 30 minutes to the journey, the well-paved road and gentle slopes made it the wiser choice. They set off on their aging Harley-Davidson motorcycle, a relic of the 1980s that still purred like a loyal companion. My aunt climbed on as the pillion rider, wrapping herself tightly in her shawl against the biting cold. The chill of the wind nipped at their faces as they merged onto the highway. As the bike hummed along, the couple began to talk about the evening's events. They lamented how no one in the family had thought to offer them a place to stay for the night. My uncle, though grumbling about the inconvenience, couldn't help but enjoy the scenic beauty. The highway was flanked by towering pine trees and majestic snow-capped peaks, their silhouettes bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight. 10 minutes into the ride, the serenity of the journey began to waver. A sense of unease crept over them as the road stretched ahead, eerily empty. The silence, broken only by the hum of the bike, felt oppressive. It was then, as they rounded a gentle curve, that my uncle saw it. Standing about 100 yards ahead on the roadside was a figure that defied logic. At first glance, it looked human, tall and gaunt, but as they drew closer, its unnatural proportions became evident. The figure's pale, almost translucent skin glowed faintly under the moonlight. It stood unnaturally still, its elongated limbs and featureless face giving it the unsettling appearance of a mannequin left abandoned in the wilderness. My uncle slowed the bike instinctively, his eyes locked on the figure. It turned its head toward him with an almost mechanical motion, its face devoid of recognizable features save for a jagged mouth that seemed to grin unnaturally wide. Then it moved. In a blur, the entity darted behind a cluster of bushes by the roadside, its speed defying comprehension. My uncle's hands trembled on the handlebars as the bike wobbled slightly. "We need to keep going," my aunt said sharply, her voice trembling but firm. She had seen it too. Despite his fear, my uncle gripped the handlebars tightly and pressed on. The motorcycle roared as he accelerated, the figure now a haunting memory in their rearview mirror. The remaining 10 minutes of the journey felt like an eternity, but they eventually reached the safety of their driveway. When they finally stumbled inside their home, my uncle collapsed onto the couch, pale and shaking. For days, he remained ill, plagued by fever and vivid nightmares. His small business suffered as he struggled to recover, missing critical deadlines and losing several contracts. A week later, when the topic came up again, my uncle hesitantly asked my aunt, "Did you see it that night?" She nodded solemnly. "It was a Bakoda," she whispered, using the term her grandmother once used for a shape-shifting demon in Appalachian folklore. The creature, she explained, preys on the fearful, feeding off their terror. Known to haunt remote roads and forests, the Bakoda is said to appear in a grotesque form, with jagged features and unnatural speed. "What did it want?" my uncle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "To possess," she replied grimly. "It targets the scared and the weak. If we had stopped, who knows what would have happened." Though they never encountered the entity again, the memory of that night lingered, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of the wilderness. To this day, my uncle avoids late-night rides, especially on lonely highways. Some fears, once etched into the soul, never truly fade. The story begins on a frigid winter night in the early 1960s. My parents, both young teachers at the time, and my Uncle Lou, a close family friend and colleague, were driving along Interstate 80 through the barren, snow-covered stretches of Nevada. They had just turned onto I-80 in Winnemucca, heading west toward Reno. It was a desolate route, especially in the dead of winter, where even the few scattered cars seemed like rare phantoms of the road. This was an era before cell phones, GPS, or even roadside payphones. A breakdown on this lonely stretch of highway could mean hours, or worse, of waiting for help in the bitter cold. Lou, the driver, had just bought a shiny new Corvair, and he handled it with extreme caution, mindful of the icy roads and the unsettling isolation. Snow fell steadily, muffling the sounds of the night, and a heavy silence filled the car as they drove, each passenger lost in their thoughts. Then it happened, peered in the beam of the headlights. Its form was disturbingly hoarded, with long, vaporous arms that seemed to reach out toward it. Out of nowhere, a grotesque humanoid figure appeared in the beam of the headlights. Its form was disturbingly human-like, but stretched and distorted, with long, vaporous arms that seemed to reach out toward the car as though trying to grasp it. The figure hovered just above the road, its shape flickering like smoke caught in a windless space, and yet its presence felt oppressively real. Lou instinctively swerved, narrowly missing the figure, and for a fleeting moment it peered directly into the windshield. My parents described its face, or what should have been a face, as featureless and otherworldly, as if carved from mist. There was no sound, no thud as the car would have made if it struck a person or animal. The figure simply vanished into the darkness as abruptly as it had appeared. The car continued on in stunned silence. Lou, ever the skeptic, refused to stop, pressing forward with white-knuckled determination. He never admitted to seeing the figure, but those who knew him best believed he would have stopped if he thought it was a real, living person in need of help. My parents, however, were shaken to their cores, and to this day, they disagree about what exactly they saw that night. Years later, as the story was retold in hushed tones, the truth, or something close to it, began to emerge. That stretch of I-80 had long been known for its dark history of disappearances and grisly discoveries. In the early 1970s, the bodies of several women were found scattered along the highway. In July 1972, the nude body of a young woman, shot with a .22 caliber gun, was discovered near the Star Valley exit. Later that year, another woman's body was found strangled and burned north of Highway 93, while a third victim was uncovered in Elko. In 1978, two more women were found, one stuffed into a duffel bag and buried in a shallow grave near the Inlay exit. The second victim, Nan Dixon, vanished without a trace after being last seen at a Texaco station in Lovelock. Her abandoned car was found 4 years later, bearing eerie signs of foul play, including black electrical tape with strands of hair. The tragedies didn't stop there. In 2006, Judith Casita disappeared along the same stretch of highway, her car found abandoned on a dirt road. 5 years later, in 2011, Patrick Carnes was last seen driving westbound, but his car was inexplicably discovered on the eastbound side of the highway. His body never found. That same year, Army soldier Joseph Bushling vanished after calling a friend for help, saying he had run out of gas. His car was discovered miles from his last known location, but his body was never recovered. Over the decades, I-80 through Nevada has earned a grim reputation. Reports estimate that more than 500 bodies have been found along the highway, leading many to believe it's a hunting ground for one or more serial killers. Yet others suspect something far more sinister, something supernatural, is at play. To this day, my parents, now in their 80s, remain haunted by that strange figure they saw on the highway all those years ago. My mother is convinced it was a ghost, a spirit trapped in the limestone-rich land, its energy replaying a moment of terror or anguish. My father, a man of science, leans toward a more rational explanation, suggesting it was an optical illusion caused by swamp gases, or perhaps a trick of the snowy landscape and their own tired minds. Still, the question remains, could this figure somehow be connected to the dark history of I-80? Were the disappearances and murders the work of a human predator? Or could the figure itself have been a harbinger of doom, an omen for those who dared to cross its path? Even as time has dulled the fear, the story lingers in my family, Faye, shared during long nights when the wind howls outside and shadows stretch across the walls. My parents often wonder if others have seen the same figure, or if the desolation of that Nevada highway has conjured unique terrors for each traveler who dares to traverse it at night. As for me, I've never driven that stretch of road, and I don't plan to. Whether haunted by ghosts, marked by tragedy, or simply cursed by geography, I-80 in Nevada carries an air of foreboding that's hard to ignore. If you ever find yourself traveling that highway at night, remember, some roads are lonelier and darker than they seem. It was the winter of 2010, and our family had just finished a long Thanksgiving visit with my grandmother in a small town in rural Maine. With the holidays winding down, my parents and I boarded a night bus headed back to Boston. The biting cold and the snow-covered landscape made the journey feel like something out of an eerie New England postcard. Night buses have their own kind of rhythm. Passengers settle in, the driver powers through the dark roads, and somewhere along the route there's always a stop at a roadside diner. Ours came at a little after midnight when the bus pulled into a lonely truck stop flanked by a rundown diner and a snowy, empty parking lot. The passengers shuffled out, grateful for the chance to stretch their legs and grab some food. Inside, the diner was a warm contrast to the icy winds outside. As we sat around a rickety table, sipping steaming cups of coffee and eating sandwiches, the chill of the winter seemed almost tolerable. But the tranquility was short-lived. We had just stepped back into the frosty night, preparing to board the bus again, when it happened. The hum of conversation and the crunch of snow underfoot were interrupted by a strange, low rumble. It grew louder until the source came into view, a motorcycle speeding down the desolate highway. But there was something terribly wrong. The rider had no head. The bike sped past the truck stop, the rider sitting upright, his hands firmly gripping the handlebars and his feet planted on the pedals as if nothing was amiss. The machine roared into the night, vanishing down the dark highway like a phantom fleeing some unseen torment. For a moment, no one spoke. Every passenger froze in place, staring at the road where the headless figure had disappeared. The cold winter air seemed to grow even more frigid, as if the chill had seeped into our very bones. My mother was so paralyzed with shock that she couldn't move even as we tugged her toward the bus. Others huddled together, murmuring prayers or whispering to one another in hushed, fearful tones. Some claimed it was the spirit of a long-dead biker doomed to wander these roads. Others insisted it was a bad omen, a warning that the rest of our journey would not be safe. Fear hung thick in the air as the bus driver, pale and visibly shaken, declared he wouldn't drive another mile until a local pastor came to bless the vehicle. It was nearly 2 a.m. by the time the pastor arrived. He carried a small Bible and a vial of holy water, which he sprinkled over the bus while murmuring prayers for protection. The passengers, huddled in the freezing cold, watched solemnly as the ritual unfolded. The driver, satisfied that the evil had been warded off, finally agreed to resume the journey. By dawn, the memory of the headless biker still lingered in the minds of everyone aboard. But what we discovered later sent an even colder shiver down our spines. The truth behind the terrifying vision was more horrifying than any ghost story. As we neared our destination, we passed a police barricade. A tow truck was hauling away a mangled motorcycle, and a few officers were taking notes by a crumpled semi-truck carrying oversized steel sheets. From our seats, we could see the blood-streaked highway and the grim expressions of the authorities. A local news report would later reveal the chilling details. Earlier that night, a biker speeding down the highway had collided with the steel sheets overhanging from the back of the semi-truck. The sharp edges of the steel had severed his head instantly. At the high speed he was traveling, the bike had continued down the road for nearly a mile before finally toppling over. The ghostly sight we had witnessed wasn't a phantom or an omen. It was the tragic aftermath of a gruesome accident. The horror lay not in the supernatural, but in the fragility of life and the dangers of the road. Even now, every time I see a semi-truck with an oversized load or hear the roar of a motorcycle at night, I think of that headless biker. Was it merely an accident, or had his spirit returned to haunt the highway, replaying his final moments over and over again? Perhaps some roads are destined to hold on to the memories of those who have traveled them and those who never made it home. This story is not mine, but my mother-in-law's, and it's something that continues to affect our family to this day. It began about 15 years ago on a seemingly ordinary summer afternoon, but its repercussions have been anything but ordinary. My mother-in-law, Varsha, and my father-in-law were traveling by motorcycle along US Highway 73, a quiet rural stretch cutting through fields and small towns in Kansas. The sun blazed overhead and the heat shimmered off the asphalt. The ride had been uneventful until thirst compelled them to stop. Spotting an old hand pump beneath a large oak tree at the side of the road, they decided to take a break. The scene was serene as they quenched their thirst with the cool water from the pump. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves and the distant hum of insects was the only noise in the air. Just as they prepared to leave, my mother-in-law froze. A voice called her name, Varsha. The sound was clear, unmistakable, and chilling. Startled, she spun around, scanning the empty fields and the road for the source. But there was no one in sight. Not a single car, not a passing pedestrian, not even a bird perched on a branch. My father-in-law saw her reaction and asked what was wrong, but when she explained, he shrugged it off as a trick of the wind or her imagination. They continued their journey, but something had shifted within her. That single moment marked the beginning of an unrelenting, eerie phenomenon that no one could explain. From that day forward, my mother-in-law could no longer sleep peacefully. Nights became a torment of vivid, unsettling dreams. These were no ordinary dreams. They were visions, fragments of events yet to unfold. The faces of the dead would appear to her, and she began to see premonitions of tragedies within the family. Worse still, every prediction came true. At first, my in-laws dismissed her experiences as stress or mere coincidences. When her insomnia became unbearable, they sought help at a renowned hospital in Kansas City. She was diagnosed with chronic insomnia and prescribed powerful medications, but nothing worked. No matter how high the dosage, sleep eluded her, and the dreams persisted. When I married into the family, I heard these stories and assumed they were exaggerated or the result of an overactive imagination. But then I witnessed events that made me reconsider. One incident still gives me chills. About a month ago, my father-in-law's elder brother was hospitalized with a severe illness. As the family fretted over his condition, my mother-in-law quietly told her husband the exact time and manner in which his brother would pass. Days later, her prediction came true, down to the minute. There have been countless other instances over the years. She foresaw accidents, illnesses, and losses within the family. Each time, her visions were eerily accurate. While some family members found her ability unsettling, others began to rely on her warnings, even though it caused her immense emotional strain. Imagine living with such a gift, or curse. My mother-in-law has spent the last 15 years tormented by dreams she cannot control and a reality she cannot escape. She avoids discussing her experiences in public, fearing ridicule or disbelief. Yet within the family, her abilities have become an unspoken truth, a weight we all carry in different ways. For her, the agony is compounded by the inability to sleep. Despite trying every available medication and treatment, relief remains out of reach. Some nights, she sits awake for hours, staring into the darkness, haunted by the knowledge of what is to come. Over the years, we have sought explanations beyond medicine. Some have suggested that the voice she heard on Highway 73 was a spirit, calling her and awakening this ability. Others believe it was a moment of spiritual awakening tied to the land's history. Highway 73 cuts through areas steeped in Native American history, and some speculate that she may have encountered a lingering presence tied to the past. We've even consulted spiritual healers and clergy hoping for answers or solace, but the mystery remains. Was the voice a warning, a gift, or a curse? We may never know. 15 years later, my mother-in-law continues to endure her strange reality. For the rest of us, it's a mixture of awe, fear, and heartbreak. Her visions, while accurate, bring her no peace, only the weight of knowledge she never asked for. Highway 73 may look like an ordinary road, but for our family, it's the place where everything changed. We'll never forget the voice that called her name or the life it set into motion. So the next time you find yourself on a lonely highway, remember this story. Sometimes what you can't see may be far more real and far more haunting than what you can. During my college years, I heard many chilling tales about haunted places and ghostly encounters, but one story stands out in my memory. It was told to me by my friend Anitha, who recounted an unforgettable experience her elder sister had during a late night drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Anitha's sister had just given birth and had spent several months recuperating at her mother's home in a small rural town deep in the mountains. When the baby was 6 months old, she decided to return to her home in Asheville, North Carolina. To make the 8-hour journey more manageable, the family hired a car and driver, thinking it would offer the convenience of stopping whenever necessary. They set out in the late afternoon, hoping to reach Asheville by midnight. The route cut through winding mountain roads surrounded by thick forests that seemed to grow darker and more imposing as night fell. By the time they left behind the lights of the villages, the only illumination came from the car's headlights, which carved eerie patterns into the darkness. Around 10 p.m., as the car meandered along a particularly desolate stretch of road, the driver abruptly slowed down and brought the vehicle to a complete stop. Ahead of them, standing motionless in the middle of the road, was the silhouette of a woman. She was dressed in flowing white, the sapat, her long hair cascading down her back. The driver immediately became visibly uneasy. "I've heard stories about this," he muttered. "There's talk of a ghost woman haunting these roads. People say she's looking for revenge or trying to lure travelers to their doom." Anitha's brother-in-law, seated in the front passenger seat, tried to brush off the driver's concerns, but the man was adamant. "I'm not driving past her," he said. "These mountains are full of strange things, and I'm not risking it." The raised voices roused Anitha's sister, who had been napping in the back seat, her infant son cradled in her arms. She sat up, puzzled by the commotion, and asked what was happening. When the others explained, she peered out the windshield and saw the figure herself. There the woman stood, motionless, with her back to them, her stark white dress standing out against the inky blackness of the mountain road. Anitha's sister was not one to entertain superstitions or ghost stories, especially when they interfered with her getting home after a long journey. "This is ridiculous," she said firmly. Despite the protests from her husband and the driver, she made up her mind. With the baby securely in one arm, she opened the car door and stepped out onto the cold, dark road. The others were stunned into silence, watching her approach the figure with a confidence that seemed out of place given the eerie atmosphere. As she drew closer, the woman in white suddenly turned around. Her face was pale, her loose hair obscuring much of her features, and she took a step toward Anitha's sister. For a brief moment, there was a collective intake of breath from those watching, convinced this was the moment when something otherworldly would occur. But Anitha's sister did something no one expected. Without hesitation, she raised her free hand and slapped the woman across the face. "What do you think you're doing?" she scolded. "Standing in the middle of the road like this and scaring people who are already exhausted. Go home and stop causing trouble." The woman in white, utterly stunned, she stammered something incoherent, then quickly turned and fled, disappearing down a narrow dirt path that led off the main road. Within seconds, she was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Anitha's sister returned to the car, brushing off the shocked expressions of her fellow travelers. "It's just some troublemaker trying to scare people," she said dismissively. "Let's go." The driver, thoroughly embarrassed, sheepishly started the car and resumed the journey. The rest of the ride was uneventful, though the tension lingered. Everyone, especially the driver, was in awe of Anitha's sister's courage and practicality. Later, the family speculated about the mysterious woman. It seemed likely she was just a bored local, pulling pranks on unsuspecting travelers by dressing in a white gown and letting her hair down to play the part of a ghost. But her antics had caused enough fear to stop cars in their tracks and fuel rumors of a haunting on the mountain road. While the story lacked the supernatural horror of true ghost tales, it left a lasting impression. It was a reminder that not every eerie figure in the dark is a ghost, but sometimes human mischief can be just as unnerving. To this day, Anitha's sister's boldness is the highlight of the tale, a testament to how confronting fear head-on can reveal the truth behind even the most spine-chilling encounters. For the rest of us, though, Her story serves as a cautionary tale. Whether ghosts or pranksters, the roads at night hold mysteries best approached with caution and a healthy dose of courage. Let me share a chilling experience I had in October 2008. I was 22 at the time, brimming with the eagerness of youth and a thirst for adventure. When my childhood friend invited me to accompany him to his family's hometown in a remote part of Nevada to celebrate a festival, I jumped at the opportunity without a second thought. Little did I know this journey would leave me with a memory that still haunts me to this day. After an exhausting 20-hour bus ride from Los Angeles to a small desert town near the Nevada-Arizona border, we finally arrived. The village was exactly how I had pictured a remote desert settlement. Quiet, with sandy streets, modest homes, and a clear view of the starry night sky. My friend's family was hosting a traditional celebration honoring their cultural heritage. The centerpiece of the festival was a revered elderly woman known for entering a trance-like state, believed to be possessed by a desert spirit, during which she would offer blessings and advice to the townsfolk. The event, though fascinating, stretched late into the night, ending around 10 p.m. My friend suggested we stay overnight at his family's home, but I had an important meeting back in LA the following day and insisted on leaving immediately. The closest train station in Kingman, Arizona was 75 miles away, and I convinced him to make the journey that night. As we searched for transportation, several villagers warned us against traveling after dark. They spoke in hushed tones about the area's paranormal activity, recounting eerie tales of strange figures appearing on the road and ghostly voices whispering in the desert wind. "Son, it's not safe to go now," an elderly man pleaded. "This land has seen too much, wars, deaths, and things you wouldn't understand. Please, stay the night." Their concern was genuine, but I was skeptical and pressed forward. Eventually, we found a local driver, a gruff man in his late 40s with a beat-up blue Jeep, who reluctantly agreed to take us to Kingman for double his usual fare. After a few shots of whiskey to steel his nerves, he returned to pick us up around midnight. The Jeep was an open-top vehicle, and the desert night was eerily silent, broken only by the crunch of tires on the dirt road and the distant howl of coyotes. My friend quickly fell asleep on the back seat, leaving me to sit beside the driver and chat to keep us both alert. The only source of light was the Jeep's headlights, casting long, shifting shadows on the barren landscape. About 15 miles into the journey, the road turned rough, riddled with potholes. The driver slowed to a crawl, and as we navigated the uneven terrain, I heard a whisper in my ear. "Hey! Hey!" Startled, I turned to see who had spoken, but there was no one there. A split second later, I heard a chilling, guttural laugh, loud and unmistakable, as if someone were sitting right behind me. I quickly glanced at my friend, who was still fast asleep, and then at the driver, who was pale and trembling. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded, his voice shaking as he muttered, "I heard it too." Without another word, he slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the Jeep to 90 miles per hour on the bumpy road. The laughter continued, echoing louder and louder, as if mocking us. My heart raced as I looked around the Jeep, hoping to find a rational explanation, but there was nothing, just the endless desert. Suddenly, the driver screamed, "Don't look back." I froze. "Why?" I managed to ask. His voice cracked as he replied, "Someone just put their hand on my shoulder." I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel an oppressive presence behind me. Moments later, the headlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the road, cloaked in shadow. As we drew closer, the figure stepped into the middle of the road, blocking our path. The driver honked and shouted, but the figure didn't move. When we were just 10 feet away, it suddenly vanished into thin air. Neither of us spoke after that. The driver kept his foot on the gas, speeding through the darkness as if his life depended on it. We reached Kingman just before dawn, shaken but alive. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've replayed the events over and over in my mind, searching for a logical explanation, but none of it makes sense. The laughter, the hand on the driver's shoulder, the vanishing figure, they all defy reason. Even now, as I write this, a chill runs down my spine. The desert is a vast and mysterious place, and that night It felt alive with something far beyond my understanding. If there's one thing I learned, it's to respect the warnings of locals. Some places hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. When I was 7 years old, I was unexpectedly called to the principal's office. Sitting there was my uncle, his face somber. He broke the news. My Budia Nani, maternal great-grandmother, had passed away. He had come to take me to the crematorium, where the rest of the family was waiting for me. At that age, I didn't fully grasp the weight of his words. Death was a concept I had only vaguely understood. My memories of Budia Nani were of an affectionate and hardworking woman, her frail frame bent with age, but her spirit unyielding. She lived in a small village with my maternal grandfather, and we visited her once or twice a year. Her face would always light up when she saw me, and her warmth left a lasting impression on my young heart. The scene at the crematorium was overwhelming. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood. My uncle hurriedly undressed me, bathed me in water from the Ganges, and wrapped me in a Ram Nami cloth. I felt disoriented as I was led to the pyre where her body lay, partially covered with only her serene face and fragile feet visible. It was my first close encounter with death and Hindu last rites. The chants, the rituals, and the raw emotion around me were both surreal and unsettling. I stood there, a small boy among grieving adults, trying to make sense of it all. Then, a dispute broke out, a heated argument among the extended family about who should light the pyre. Traditionally, the eldest male relative of the deceased performs the last rites. My Budia Nani had only one son, my maternal grandfather, but he was too frail to undertake the ritual. That made me, at 7 years old, the next in line. However, this decision did not sit well with some of the extended family. My maternal grandfather's cousins insisted that one of them should perform the rites instead. Unbeknownst to me, property claims were tied to this ritual. Whoever lit the pyre would have a symbolic and sometimes legal claim to certain family assets. The argument grew louder. I stood there, bewildered, holding the ceremonial flaming torch, while one of my maternal grandfather's cousins, also wrapped in a Ram Nami, stood ready to take my place. The unexplainable moment. Then it happened. Amid the chaos, there was a sudden whoosh. A gust of wind swept through, and without warning, the pyre ignited on its own. Flames roared to life, engulfing the wood and her body in seconds. For a moment, everyone froze. The Damraja, the cremation grounds undertaker, stared wide-eyed, his jaw slightly agape. "I've never seen anything like this in my entire life," he murmured, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. The arguing family members fell silent, their disputes forgotten in the face of this inexplicable phenomenon. My uncle nudged me forward, and the Damraja quickly guided me through the remaining rites. I circled the blazing pyre, completing the Mukagni ceremony by symbolically offering the flame to what was already burning fiercely. The moment became the stuff of family legend. Rational minds suggested that embers from an adjacent pyre, carried by the wind, had ignited the wood. But even the Damraja, who had spent a lifetime witnessing cremations, dismissed this as a common occurrence. He insisted there was something extraordinary about what had happened. For the family, the event solidified Budia Nani's legacy. She had always been fiercely independent, a woman who had lived on her own terms, and now it seemed she had chosen to leave the world the same way, lighting her own pyre as if to declare that she needed no one, not even in death. To this day, the story is recounted during family gatherings. My Budia Nani is remembered not just as a loving great-grandmother, but as a figure of strength and independence, even in the afterlife. Her final act, whether rational or supernatural, remains a poignant reminder of her indomitable spirit, a woman who lived and died entirely on her own terms. Whenever I visit her village or pass by a cremation ground, I think of that day. The smell of burning wood, the sound of chanting, and the sight of her self-lit pyre are etched into my memory, a mix of awe, fear, and deep respect for a woman who, even in death, was unforgettable.